All right, so this whole unit, we've been talking about all things, especially costs, related to buying a house. We talked a little bit about condos, okay? And we touched briefly on apartments, but that's when we were only talking about buying insurance for your belongings in an apartment. Now we're going to focus on, as the final lesson, should you buy a house or should you rent either an apartment or you can rent houses? Sometimes there's some opportunities where you can rent, then buy a house. But we're basically going to talk about, okay, what's sort of the long-term cost of renting? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? What are the long-term costs of buying? And what are the advantages and disadvantages? So for renting, because we haven't really talked about this too much, these are some of the things you need to think about when you're deciding, should I rent a house, or if I have enough for a down payment, should I think about buying a house, or should I rent an apartment? Okay, first thing you want to know, obviously, how much the rental payments are and how is the rent paid. Usually the rent is paid when you first rent a place. You have to pay the first and last month of your rental, and then you have to pay the rent at usually the beginning of every month or at the end of every month. And a couple of other things, what kind of utilities? A lot of times when you rent an apartment or even a house, they'll include water and electricity, which means you won't have to pay for those. If you buy your own house, you're going to have to pay for water and electricity and heat. Sorry, should have added heating as well. Some rental places, houses or apartments, they might be furnished, which means it's got furniture, it's got appliances. Maybe all you need are just your clothes and things to eat with. Insurance. Sometimes insurance is covered, sometimes it's not. Always a good thing to get insurance because you just never know what's going to happen. We've already talked about that. Okay. And finally, when you buy a house, like I said, you normally have to put a down payment down. It could be like 5% of the cost of the home, or if you have more money, you can put more money down, which means your mortgage payments will be less. But if you decide, okay, I'm not going to buy a house just yet, basically what happens when you buy a home, you're going to be paying a lot of money up front. And we saw that with all the costs, like the cost of getting a lawyer, the costs of property taxes, the cost of insurance and things like that. You know, other land surveys, things like that, transfer tax. You generally pay a fair amount up front that you wouldn't have to do if you rented. You wouldn't have to pay property taxes. You wouldn't have to do all those lawyer fees. Okay? You just sign an agreement with whoever owns the apartment complex or whoever owns the house, and away you go. Okay? So what could you do with that money? Well, you could invest it. And hopefully it builds into an amount that you can buy a house down the road because you'll have a bigger down payment. Because perhaps what, you know, usually with younger people, their situation is, yeah, they could probably afford it every month, a house, but it's those initial fees and the down payment, right? Because if you're looking at, I mean, a basic house, $300,000. 5% down, $15,000. So you're going to need $15,000 to start purchasing this house. And we saw that it could cost up to 10 grand in initial costs. So you're looking at, do I have $25,000 on me so that I can start? And then what will happen is, over the long run, okay, buying a house is better because you'll start paying approximately the same amount every month as if you rent. And renting, you're putting your money to nothing. That you're giving your money away. Yes, you have a place to live, okay, but you're not owning any part of the apartment or the house. Okay, it's just money. It's money being paid out that you're not going to get back.
And then it's still affecting, right?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, depending on the situation. So that's sort of the key when you start up, when you're thinking about buying a home. And that's why so many young people are having difficulties buying a home, because they don't have those initial amounts to pay yet. Yes, they're making good money, but they haven't saved up enough for a down payment. You know, because I mean, like if you're looking as a couple and you have a kid or two, well, now you're looking at homes like 700,000, okay? Or here, 500,000, something like that, which means now you're looking at a down payment minimum of 25 grand plus your initial costs. So do you have that kind of money? So really, and I read this somewhere, that the average age that a person buys a home now has now become older. I think it used to be like a long time ago, you could basically buy a home and start to get settled late 20s, somewhere around there. Now it's in your 30s, like mid 30s, probably later. Okay, which is pretty substantial part of your life that you've lived so far. Okay, so why would you consider renting? Well, some of these apply to sort of an apartment, because if you rent a house, you're still going to have to do some of these. So you don't want to have a yard to take care of. So having an apartment or even a condo, renting a condo, you can, would be good. Then you don't have to worry about upkeeping the yard. Pets, again, we saw it depends. Okay, for apartments, yes, some are pet friendly, some are not. For houses, I think it's generally hard to find houses where they're allowed pets, and you're going to pay for it if they do, like Sasha found that one. Okay. Upkeep of the property, you know, it's, I mean, and this applies to houses and apartments when you're renting. You don't have to worry about it. That's the responsibility of the person that owns the apartment complex or the person that owns the house. So if something goes out, if a furnace goes out, it's going to be their responsibility to pay for it, not yours. And then I talked about a down payment. Okay, so let's just look at a couple of examples where we have to do some calculations about renting and about buying. So some of this is review we've already done already. So you've got a situation where you have the opportunity to purchase a home at $195,000 with a down payment of $25,000. $195,000 is not that realistic, I will tell you. Or you can rent a similar home for $975 a month, which again, I should probably bump this up 200,000 and this maybe up another 400 or 500 to make it more realistic. But anyway, we'll use these numbers because they're a little simpler to work with. If you decide to rent the house for $975, how much money will you spend after 1 year? That's a pretty straightforward calculation. How would you do that?
975 times 4.
975 times 5. And that means you're going to pay $11,700 in rent. Okay. And remember, all of that is being paid out. You have not built value in anything because you don't own any part of the house. Whereas if you buy, now you start to own part of the house, like less what you have to pay for your mortgage. All right, table. We're going to find out how much is this going to cost us if, I mean, and this is pretty unrealistic because staying in an apartment for 20 years, likely not going to happen. But anyway, let's figure it out the long run. And rents generally increases per year, the rental charge. Okay, so we've got a situation where for this house, the rental charge is going to increase 2% per year. And this table shows us how much the rent is going to be when it increases 2%, how much the total rent's going to be for that year, and what's the total amount you've paid over the total years you've lived in it. So we would go from here to here, this is increasing by 2%. So to calculate an increase of 2%, that's the same as multiplying by 1.02. So if you were to multiply all of these by 1.02, you would get to the next number in the column. How do we figure out the total cost? Well, we take the cost of rent and then we just times 12. How would we find the total amount paid? Well, you'd have to find the total amount paid in previous years plus that year. So it would be this plus previous years. So if we follow that reasoning, we can finish the 20th row for year 20. Sorry, I all of a sudden got music. But yet we are still recording. Okay. So if we go down here, keeping in mind what we did. So in year 19, the rent has gone from $975 a month to $1,392.54. For the 20th year, we're going to times by 1.02 and round to the nearest cent. That will get us how much is the rent, the monthly rent in year 20. And that works out to $1,420 and 39 cents. That's how much you're paying every month in the 20th year you're in this place. So how much is it going to cost you for the year? Well, you just multiply that by 12 to get this column. And it's going to be $17,044.68 that you pay for that year in rent. What's the total amount that you've paid over the time you've lived in this place? Well, it's the previous total paid. So up to 19 years, you paid almost $270,000 in rent. Okay, and we got to add this. So we got to add $17,044.68 to this, and we're going to get $284,279.22.
But that point, it should be better to buy a house.
Yeah, like, I mean, 10 years earlier, it's probably better to buy a house. Because even look at year 10, you know, year 10, you're at almost $130,000 that you paid in rent. And all that, like I said, all that's been paid out. You haven't built any wealth in anything. You haven't built any ownership in anything. Whereas when you do it with a house, every time you pay, you're building what we call, and we've called this before, equity in the house. That means the value that you have in the house. So that's a lot paying out. And All right, so let's just say that happened, but let's also say over the time, you know, I mean, let's say, I don't know, let's say you started this when you were 18 and you ended up living in a place for, you know, you got some, you were able to sort of get student loans and afford a place until while you went through school, and then you went through school, got a good career job, started making more money, okay? And then you're sort of getting to the point where, okay, I don't have to worry about renting. I'm making enough money, I can start putting it away for a down payment. So let's say you did that. And let's say you had remember you had $25,000 for a down payment for this house, okay? And you decided, you know what? Not quite ready yet to commit to a house, so I'm going to invest that $25,000. And I am going to make 5% a year compounded annually. So you can see a table here. How do we get from one value, for the value of the investment in year 1 to year 2? We multiply by 1.05. Because it's increasing 5%. Okay? Whenever you want to find, if something has done a percentage increase and you want to find the new amount, always do 1 point, whatever that percent is, as a decimal. So if something increases by 12%, you multiply by 1.12. If something increases by 7%, you multiply by 1.07, etc. So this money, and remember, we're not putting anything more into this. We just put the 25,000 and let it grow. So what's going to be the amount that I have after 20 years? Well, it's going to be the 19th year, which is over 60,000, times 1.05 is going to give us, is that right? Sorry, I just need to, that doesn't seem right. The amount that I have there. Yeah, it's not. I put 60,000. It should be 63,000. $173.75. That's a pretty big chunk. Okay. That's a good chunk of money. Now, realistically, yeah, because we finished this question. Let's look at this realistically. If you had the opportunity to buy a home for $195,000, like in this example, and you had a $25,000 down payment, go for the home. Absolutely. Because that's a big chunk of money for a down payment in these days, in this economy. Because if you think about it, there's that music again. Maybe it's just voices in my head. I thought I got rid of those voices in my head. Okay. Where was I at? So yeah, like let's just round up 195 to 2,000. Okay, or 200,000. 5% down payment, that's 10 grand. So you could realistically put 10 grand of that $25,000 you have for a down payment. More if you wanted to. And you'd have plenty to cover the initial cost of buying a house. So in a situation like this, I wouldn't even go to the investing. But that being said, like I said, 195,000 is not really realistic for the cost of the house. Okay, it would be a pretty rundown house. Okay, or it could be in a very rundown neighborhood, something that you're not very keen on. So I think more realistically would be if the house costs between 3 and 4. Okay, I mean that you could get a decent house. Okay. Second example. So that previous example, we saw how much potentially you'd have to pay if you rented for a long time. And how that would compare, and how your interest would build if you were able to save some money while you were renting. Okay? But I think the big thing out of that example is that's a lot of rental paid over 20 years. Okay, fine. So we're going back to example 1. Remember, the house was $195,000. You put down a $25,000 down payment. Okay, so you decided, no, I'm going to buy a house because I think buying a house is a better deal. So using that amortization table, and we first saw it in lesson 1.3. It's also in exercise 1.7 if you need to take it, or if you need to look at it. So going back here, there's, nope, that's not it. Where's my amortization table? Where's my amortization table? Yeah, it should be here. There we go. Okay, so $195,000 for the house. You pay $25,000 down, and then you're going to take a mortgage out for 20 years at 3.5%. And you need to figure out, okay, how much is this going to cost you? So how much is the mortgage loan you're going to have to take? Well, it's the cost of the house, 195, minus what you put down, 25. So you need to take a loan or a mortgage, because it's a house, for 170,000. The time and rate you've been given, or that you're going to go with, 20 years at 3.5%. So for every $1,000 that you borrow at 3.5% for 20 years, is how much? 3.5, 20 years. Anybody got it? Anybody got the table in front of them? No? Okay, I'll just give it to you. It's going to work out to $5.79 for every 1,000. Okay? So remember how we calculate our monthly payment from here. We need to figure out how many thousands are we borrowing. Well, to figure out how many thousands we are borrowing, we take the amounts that we're borrowing, divide 1,000. So that means we're borrowing 107, it makes sense, 170 of them. And each one of those costs $5.79. So we multiply that to get our monthly mortgage of $984.30, which is really not that far off from what the rent was. But keeping in mind that you would have to pay a whole bunch of initial costs on top of this to get started. But this would be what it would eventually work out to, okay, which probably in the end, as more and more years go by, would end up being then the rent, monthly rent. Okay. Here, we've done a table like this before. This is going to calculate for us the payment schedule, how much left you have on the mortgage, how much equity you have in the house, the total you've paid out over the first year. Okay, and we calculated these before. in, I believe it was in unit less than 1.3. So it's always going to be $984.30 per month. Part of that is going to be what goes back to the actual loan, the principal. Part of that is what we have to pay in interest. As every month goes by, you're putting more and more back towards the principal and you're paying less and less interest. We've talked about this before. So we've used these formulas down here. Where's my little calculation? All right. So we're in month 12, the end of year 1. We paid $984.30. We need to figure out how much of that is going to the principal, the amount that I actually borrowed. Or sorry, first is interest. Well, the interest, I have to go to the unpaid balance from the previous month, multiply by the interest rate, multiplied by the time in years. So the unpaid balance, what I still owe on the mortgage, is here under the column unpaid balance. So that's going to be $164,547.82 times the interest rate, which was 3.5, which means you have to change it to decimal, so it becomes 0.035, times how much of a year is 1 month? How much of a year is 1 month? 112. That's going to get how much you have to pay in interest. And it's going to work out to $479.93. Okay. So of the $984.30 you paid that month, $479.93 goes to interest. The rest goes to your principal. So your principal is going to be, and I've done these before, your payments minus your interest. So your payments is $984.30 minus the interest we calculated to be $479.93, means that you're putting back $504.37 towards that loan, towards the mortgage. So how much is owing on your mortgage now? Well, it's your previous mortgage balance, $164,547.82, minus how much you paid to the principal that on the 12 month. So it's going to be your unpaid balance at the principal for that month. So therefore, sorry, this is a switch. 164,547.82 plus 504.37 gives you still owing $43.45. Remember, what's that? 45. Okay. Now remember, every time you're paying off your home, your mortgage, you're also building ownership value into the home you own, or owner's equity. So your owner's equity for that month, I'll just call it OE, is the previous owner's equity plus what you paid back to your mortgage. In other words, the principal for that month. So it's going to be the previous $30,452.18 plus the $504.37 you paid to the principal that month gives us $30,956.55. Okay. And finally, how much have you paid? Well, total paid equals previous total paid plus that payment you made. Oh, converted it to text form. Total paid equals previous total paid plus the payments that you made. And the payment, remember, was not, it wasn't the principal, it was the payment that included the principal and the interest of $984.30. So it's going to be $35,827.30 plus how much you paid that month in total, means that over 1 year, you've paid close to $37,000. Okay? But you've built up this much value. You own this amount of the home. Okay? So in this case, what you're paying out, part of it is going towards something that you will get back whenever you sell the house. Okay? I mean, part of it you're not going to get back. That's the interest part, because that's the cost of borrowing. Okay? But the principal, as that goes down, your value in the house goes up. Let's look at a couple of other things that we have to deal with too. Something that we're not going to have to deal with renting. We're going to have to deal with property taxes. Okay? So remember, property taxes, there's municipal and education. It's made up out of the two. And municipal is part general municipal and any local improvement costs. There's no local improvement costs here. So let's say you don't have any for this year. So to figure out your municipal tax rate, it's going to be how much they've assessed your property at to be taxed, or your portioned assessments, times your mill rate. And remember, mill rate, that's the cost for every 1,000. So we have to divide by 1,000. That gives us 1464.61 that you have to pay in municipal tax. Education tax, you calculate the exact same way, except you use the education tax in the way. Portion assessment is still the same, but this time we're going to multiply the mill rate of 15.492 divided by 1,000.
And that's going to give us, in education taxes or school taxes, $1,518.20. So altogether, the total property tax, I gotta add those two amounts together, 1464.61 and 1518.20. And I get a total property tax of $2,982.83.
So we're gonna have to pay that, like, we wouldn't have to pay this when we're renting, we're gonna have to pay this because we're buying it. Okay, so just to get an idea, how much are we spending in the first year? So that's from B and C. So from B, what was the total we paid out? 36,811.60. That's from the previous table. That's how much total we paid over the year in interest and principal and the down payment. That includes the down payment as well. Plus the property taxes we have to pay. Gives us $39,794.93, so almost $40,000. Before I finish E and F, let's just compare that to the rent. So I paid almost $38,000 in rent. And keep in mind, I would also have to pay initial costs when I was initially buying the home. We're not going to talk about those in this situation, but they're there. How much did we do? What was it, 11,000 something? Yeah. 11,700. So quite a bit less, right? But that's the first year. You have to keep in mind a couple of other things. So this is why they say renting is good in the short run, but buying is good in the long run, in general. Because what happens as you continue to rent, that amount you're paying out really builds up. But part of the amount that you're paying when you buy a house, that's going to owner's equity. So if you sell the house, you're going to get that money back, right? So let's say you sold the house after a year. And you sold it for $195,000. Okay? You're going to get, because this is what you've put into the house, you're going to get $30,000 back. Okay? If you sell it for $195,000. So this was, you almost paid out 37,000, but you're going to get 30,000 back. So in the end, you've only paid out 7,000. Okay. But obviously you're not going to sell the house after 1 year, but the longer you keep it, the more you're going to get. So that's why it's kind of like short-term pain, but long-term gain. All right, just to wrap these questions up. So using that payment schedule in B, what's the amount of the outstanding balance on the mortgage after 1 year? So we just have to go back, look at the outstanding balance or unpaid balance. It was this one here, $164,043.45. That was the amount. So that was $164,043. $164,043.45. But here's another kicker. Here's another thing that comes into the mix. Housing is an investment. Because unless you don't upkeep your home and just let it decay, it's going to go up in value. And your property that it's on is going to go up in value, which means you're going to even have more in owner's equity. For example, what happens if the house increases in value by 4% every year?
Well, what's the value of the house when we first started? 195.
What do I multiply by if I want to increase that by 4%? Sorry? 1.04.
Remember, that's how we do the increase?
After 1 year, your house could potentially be worth 202. That's almost an extra $8,000. Which means if you would sell it, that difference you would get back. So you see how over the long run, it really pays off to buy than to rent. We'll talk about one more example, but we'll do that tomorrow, because I think we're almost out of time now.